Everything you've been taught about financial security, save more, invest early, diversify, is advice that would have been useless in 1933. The people who actually made it through didn't have portfolios, they had gardens, full cellars, and skills the modern world has spent 100 years quietly erasing. There was a woman in Dayton, Ohio, in the summer of 1933 who woke up before 5 every morning to check the garden, not because she enjoyed the hour, because if the tomatoes were ready and she waited until afternoon, the day's canning wouldn't be finished before dark. She had 4 children, a husband who hadn't had steady work in 2 years, and a fruit cellar she intended to fill before the first frost. Every jar she sealed was a calculation, a bet against winter, against an empty pantry, against the specific helplessness that comes when you have nothing left to trade. She didn't call what she was doing survival. She called it Tuesday. By that summer, nearly 25% of the American labor force was out of work. Real gross domestic product had contracted by 29% in 4 years. 7,000 banks, roughly one-third of the entire banking system, had failed between 1930 and 1933. Wages for workers who kept their jobs had fallen 42.5% from 1929 levels. One-third of the farmers in this country had lost their land. Those are the headline numbers. History doesn't live in headlines. It lives in the habits people form when the headlines stop being abstract and start being the reason there's no money for flour. This is about 25 specific habits, ways of living, cooking, saving, storing, building, and thinking that Americans developed during the Great Depression and never fully gave up. Some faded gradually as prosperity returned and convenience culture took over. Some were still visible in the homes of Depression survivors well into the 1990s and beyond. And some are coming back now, carried by people who may not know where they originally came from. The Great Depression started with the stock market crash of October 1929. What followed was not a quick shock, it was a decade. From 1929 through 1939, the United States experienced the longest and most severe economic contraction in its modern history. The country didn't fully recover until around 1939, and even then it was wartime manufacturing, not peacetime prosperity, that finished the job. The people who lived through this were the grandparents and great-grandparents of people alive today. The greatest generation and the silent generation both came to age inside this decade. Their children, the baby boomers, were raised by parents whose household systems, whose reflexes around food and money and waste had been permanently shaped by what they'd survived. Those systems were passed down, sometimes consciously and sometimes simply by example. Here is what those systems looked like. Here is where they came from, and here is what happened to them. The first habit was growing your own food. Before the Depression, home gardens were common in rural America, but not universal. When cash income disappeared, the only reliable food source was one you controlled directly. If you had a yard, you used it. If you had a vacant lot, you negotiated for it. If you had a window box, you planted what would fit. The federal government recognized what was happening and formalized it. The USDA promoted what they called relief gardens, distributing seeds and publishing planting guides through state agricultural extension agencies. This wasn't charity, it was the government acknowledging that the food supply system had failed a significant portion of the population. The habits formed during those years carried directly into the Second World War, when home gardens were rebranded Victory Gardens. By 1943, 20 million Victory Gardens were producing more than 40% of all fresh vegetables grown in the United States that year. The gardening infrastructure that made that possible had been built during the Depression, not during the war. The war just put a flag on something people already knew how to do. The second habit was home canning and food preservation. Canning in the 1930s was not something you did once in the fall and called yourself prepared. It was continuous, seasonal labor built around the garden's production schedule. The woman in Dayton operated under a real constraint. Her mother's rule, which became her own, was no more than 4 hours from garden to jar. The tomatoes that were perfect today would be less safe to can tomorrow. What got canned was comprehensive. Corn, tomatoes, green beans, peaches preserved in thick syrups of brown sugar, cinnamon, and cloves, jellies, relishes. The fruit cellar filled with those jars wasn't just food storage, it was a form of financial security. Each sealed jar was money you wouldn't have to spend. Each row of jars was insurance against the winter months when nothing grew and cash stayed thin. Pickling was practiced alongside canning with equal seriousness. Cucumbers, carrots, beans, cauliflower, onions, beets, and more all went into brine. Drying and salting were also practiced. Meat was salt-cured, herbs were dried, root vegetables were stored in cellars between layers of soil and straw. This entire system was a parallel food economy operating inside the household. It took serious time and labor to run. It reduced dependence on cash income in ways that mattered enormously when income was unreliable. And it produced a generation of Americans who thought about food not in terms of what was available at the store this week, but in terms of what was put away for the months ahead. The third habit followed directly. Nothing in the kitchen was wasted. This wasn't a philosophy, it was arithmetic. When a family's weekly food budget might be measured in dimes, throwing away the end of a loaf of bread or the fat skimmed from a pot of soup was not a small thing. Bread crusts were toasted and used as croutons, were dried as breadcrumbs. Meat was rarely a centerpiece, it was a flavoring agent, stretched across multiple meals. A roast pot bought on Sunday might become soup on Monday, stew on Tuesday, and hash on Wednesday. The bones went into broth, the broth went into the next pot of beans. Beans became central to American working-class cooking during this period, precisely because they were nutritionally dense, cheap, filling, and extensible. Pinto beans and cornbread, navy beans and salt pork, lentil soup. These weren't dishes people ate because they wanted to. Over time, they became genuinely beloved, embedded in regional cuisines that still exist today. Cooking fat was given special treatment. Bacon grease and lard were poured into a container kept beside the stove and reused continuously. The idea of pouring grease down a drain would have seemed genuinely bizarre to a Depression-era cook. Fat was not a byproduct, it was an ingredient in its own right. The fourth habit was keeping cash outside the banking system. Between 1930 and 1932, the United States experienced 4 extended banking panics. By 1933, 1/5 of all banks that had existed in 1930 had failed. The Roosevelt administration's response was to declare a banking holiday during which every bank in the country was closed. For the people whose savings disappeared when their bank closed, this was the specific and concrete destruction of their accumulated labor. The FDIC was created in 1933 to prevent this from happening again. But the psychological damage was not undone by policy. The people who had watched their savings vanish did not simply decide to trust banks again because a new law said they should. For decades after the Depression, it was common for survivors to keep significant amounts of cash at home, in coffee cans, in the back of sock drawers, in envelopes tucked inside books. Not all of it, just enough, a reserve that didn't depend on a building being open and solvent on the day you needed it. The habit was irrational by post-FDIC logic. They maintained it anyway, because the lesson their nervous systems had learned was deeper than any regulatory guarantee. The fifth habit was the avoidance of debt. In the 1920s, the United States had begun its transition into a consumer credit society. When the crash came, that normalcy became catastrophe. Families who had taken on debt in the 1920s found themselves unable to make payments as income collapsed. Depression survivors emerged with a profound and lasting suspicion of credit. Even after the Depression ended, even after income recovered, they tended to make purchases in cash, avoid installment plans, and regard debt as something to be treated with caution rather than convenience. I remember being taught to never live on credit, save and pay cash, not as a rule that had exceptions, but as a governing principle of household life. The idea that you waited until you had the money before you bought the thing was, for that generation, not a budgeting strategy. It was a moral position. The sixth habit was sewing, mending, and making clothing last. In the 1930s, the ability to sew was not a hobby. It was a household skill as fundamental as cooking. A woman who could sew could turn her husband's worn-out work shirt into a child's garment. She could patch the knees of work pants. She could make a coat last 3 extra winters. Buttons were removed from clothing before it was cut up for other purposes and stored in jars. Zippers were salvaged. Thread was wound back onto spools. Every piece of fabric with any remaining use was kept, and the scraps that couldn't be used for clothing went into quilts or rag rugs. The seventh habit was repairing shoes. Leather-soled shoes wore through at the bottom long before the upper part gave out. During the Depression, even modest cobbler fees were sometimes out of reach. Families repaired their own shoes with whatever was at hand. Pieces of rubber tire were commonly cut and fitted to worn-through soles. Children sometimes went to school in shoes with cardboard inserts covering the holes. The practicality of keeping a pair of shoes in service for as many years as possible stayed with Depression survivors as a reflex long after they could afford new ones without hesitation. The eighth habit was saving and reusing containers of every kind. Margarine tubs stacked in towers, coffee cans filled with saved nails and screws, glass jars of every size reused for leftover soup, dry goods storage, canning, and small hardware, rubber bands saved off the newspaper, paper bags folded carefully and stored in a kitchen drawer. None of these behaviors made economic sense in the post-war era of cheap plastics and disposable packaging, but they made deep psychological sense to people who had learned from direct experience that the object you threw away this week might be the object you desperately needed next month. The environment had changed, but the nervous system remembered. The ninth habit was multi-generational living. The Depression moved extended families together, not out of preference, but out of necessity. Grandparents moved in with adult children. Adult children moved back with parents. Aunts and uncles took in siblings' families. Cousins shared rooms. This arrangement carried its own stresses, but it also provided something the post-war nuclear family could not easily reproduce. When one member of the household lost work, the others sustained it. When one person got sick, others were present. When the experienced older generation needed to pass on what they knew about gardening, canning, sewing, or building, the younger generation was literally in the same house, learning by observation rather than by choice.
The 10th habit was bartering goods and services. When banks closed and cash became scarce, the informal barter economy expanded to fill the gap. Eggs were traded for dry goods. A farmer who couldn't pay workers in cash paid them in vegetables. Firewood was split in exchange for meals. Skills, carpentry, plumbing, medical care, were exchanged for other skills or for food. This reinforced the idea that a skill or a product you produced yourself had real, concrete value that didn't depend on what any bank or currency was doing. The 11th habit was maintaining a well-stocked pantry. Not a pantry in the modern sense. A Depression-era pantry was a serious food storage system containing enough preserved food to sustain a family through several months of hardship. The goal was genuine food security, knowing that even if the income stops, the eating doesn't have to. The spring and summer were the accumulation period. The fall was a reckoning, a survey of what was stored, a calculation of what was still needed. The winter was the spending down period, when the work of summer fed the family through the months when nothing grew. Depression survivors maintained this habit long after they could afford not to. The large freezer in the basement kept full. The cupboard stocked beyond what would be needed in any reasonable week. The impulse to buy extras on sale, to put things by, to maintain a reserve, all of it traced back to the lesson that the time between abundance and scarcity can be very short. The 12th habit was knowing how to cook from nothing, not from a recipe that called for 20 ingredients, from the skills and techniques that allowed you to make something nutritious and filling from whatever happened to be available. This included knowing how to make bread from flour, water, salt, and whatever leavening you had. Knowing how to make a pot of beans stretch further by adding potatoes, cornmeal, or wild greens. Knowing how to turn the water you'd boiled vegetables in into the base for the next day's soup. Knowing how to make a cake with no eggs by substituting vinegar and baking soda. The Bureau of Home Economics published guides during the Depression that taught exactly these skills. What that effort produced was a cohort of American cooks who understood the fundamentals of food in a way that convenience culture would slowly erode. They knew what made bread rise. They knew how to adjust a dish when an ingredient was missing. They knew how much nutrition was in a pot of dried beans versus a can of commercial soup, and they knew how to make the beans taste good. The 13th habit was foraging and hunting for supplemental food. Wild greens, dandelion leaves, lamb's quarters, purslane were gathered from fields and roadsides in the spring. Wild berries were picked and preserved. Acorns were processed into flour. Hunting and trapping were practiced where accessible. Squirrel and rabbit were the most common game, small enough to be taken with minimal equipment and available in most of rural America. The knowledge required to forage usefully was the kind of embodied, place-specific knowledge that had been held by rural Americans for generations, but was already beginning to thin out as the country urbanized. The Depression interrupted that thinning temporarily, passing some of that knowledge to another generation before post-war prosperity finished the work of replacing it with the grocery store.
The 14th habit was keeping backyard chickens and small livestock. On farms, nearly every family had chickens and at least one pig fattened for harvest. Chickens provided eggs, a daily, renewable protein source, and meat and tradable chicks. A 300-pound pig, when slaughtered, yielded roughly 165 pounds of pork, enough to sustain a family of 4 for most of a year, if properly preserved. In towns and smaller cities, families kept chickens in backyard coops with a regularity that seems almost improbable now. Urban chicken keeping has returned in recent years as a kind of conscious choice. In the 1930s, it was simply what you did if you had the space and wanted eggs without paying for them. The 15th habit was saving seeds. When you grew your own vegetables, you saved seeds from the strongest, most productive plants to sow the following year. This was not a political act. It was the most economical possible approach to gardening, one that reduced dependence on purchased inputs to nearly zero. Depression-era gardeners grew varieties their parents had grown, saved seeds from those varieties, and passed the seeds to their children along with the knowledge of when to plant them and how deep. The commercial hybrid seed industry gradually replaced open-pollinated varieties through the mid-20th century. By the post-war decades, seed saving had become more effort than most home gardeners found worth making, and the knowledge began to thin. Organizations like the Seed Savers Exchange have worked to preserve heirloom varieties that would otherwise have been lost. The 16th habit was community mutual aid. The Depression was not a problem any individual family could solve through personal resourcefulness alone. In the absence of robust government programs for most of the decade, Social Security wasn't signed into law until 1935. Communities built their own systems. Church potlucks were one of the most visible forms. Families brought whatever they had and shared it. It was food sharing that preserved dignity. You were not receiving charity. You were participating in a community practice. Neighbors shared tools. Seeds were shared. Labor was exchanged. The specific daily knowledge that older community members held was transmitted through this context of mutual reliance. It is worth noting that this mutual aid was not universally available. Racial segregation shaped the Depression experience profoundly, and Black Americans in the South faced conditions that were categorically more severe. The community support networks that cushioned hardship for many white working-class families were often unavailable to or actively hostile toward Black families. This part of the Depression's history belongs in the record alongside everything else. The 18th habit was making homemade versions of things previously purchased: bread, beer and root beer, wine from whatever fruit was available, cheese, soap. The line between what you made and what you bought moved significantly toward making during the Depression years. The ability to bake bread reliably had been declining since the Industrial Revolution began shifting production out of the household and into factories. The Depression interrupted that decline by making commercial bread an expense the budget couldn't always absorb. Families baked again, and in baking again, they kept alive the embodied knowledge of how bread worked, how dough was supposed to feel, how a proofed loaf differed from an unproofed one. The 18th habit was extreme reduction of waste in every category. A family of 6 during the Depression might produce 1 small barrel of trash per week. That's a figure that appears in first-hand accounts of Depression-era housekeeping, and it was possible because of how thoroughly everything was used before it was discarded. Vegetable scraps went into stock or the compost pile. Paper was reused and then stuffed into walls as insulation. Fabric was repurposed until it was past repurposing, then cut into cleaning rags. Tin cans were washed and repurposed for storage. The generation that grew up with this level of waste reduction carried it forward as a reflex. They washed and reused plastic bags in an era when plastic bags were cheap and disposable. They smoothed out aluminum foil and used it again. They repaired appliances rather than replacing them. Whether these habits made economic sense in the post-war context is a separate question from whether they persisted. They persisted. The 19th habit was maintaining physical appearance despite poverty. Depression-era Americans, particularly mothers with children, maintained fierce standards of cleanliness and presentability in the face of conditions that made those standards genuinely difficult to achieve. Children were sent to school in clothing that was carefully mended and pressed. Shoes were polished, hair was combed. The appearance of respectability was, in this context, a form of dignity, a refusal to be defined by circumstances largely beyond individual control. There was also a practical dimension. Many Americans during this period were too proud to seek charity, and the ability to present as self-sufficient determined how you were treated by employers, neighbors, and relief workers. The habit of keeping what you had clean, repaired, and presentable was simultaneously about dignity, about economic calculation, and about the specific social dynamics of a period when visible poverty could cost you opportunities you couldn't afford to lose. The 20th habit was absolute cash-only purchasing. The Depression-era motto, "No cash, no purchase." The experience of watching debt destroy families who had bought homes, cars, and appliances on installment plans during the 1920s and then found themselves unable to make payments when income vanished produced a generation that regarded consumer credit with deep suspicion. What this produced in the households of Depression survivors was often a complicated relationship to consumption that their children and grandchildren found difficult to fully understand. A grandfather who had survived the Depression might leave a substantial inheritance built from a modest farming income, having never bought anything he couldn't pay for in full, having lived in the same modest house for decades, having repaired everything that broke rather than replacing it, having planted a garden every year until he couldn't physically do it anymore. The wealth wasn't achieved through financial sophistication. It was achieved through a lifetime of not spending money he didn't have. The 21st habit was teaching children to work. In Depression-era households, children were participants in the household economy from an early age. They picked vegetables and helped with canning. They gathered eggs and fed chickens. They learned to sew by helping with mending. They learned to bake by standing next to someone who already knew. What this produced was the transmission of practical knowledge through direct participation. A child who had helped can 50 quarts of green beans over 5 summers understood food preservation not as a concept, but as a physical skill stored in the muscles and the hands. The knowledge was embodied rather than academic, and that made it durable. The 22nd habit was multiple uses for every ingredient. The Depression-era kitchen operated on the principle of cascading use, each ingredient extracted for as much value as possible before anything was discarded. Bones from a roast became the next batch of stock. Stock became the base for soup. Day-old bread became bread pudding or stuffing or breadcrumbs for the next week. Nothing that still had nutritional value, flavor value, or functional value was treated as a single-use item. This extended beyond the kitchen. A worn-out garment became material for a quilt. A broken tool handle was replaced with a new one cut from wood because the metal head was still good. An empty coffee can became a nesting box for the chickens, or a container for saved seeds, or a planter for starting seedlings. The Depression conditioned a generation to see the residual value in things that a consumer culture would define as spent. The 23rd habit was maintaining relationships with neighbors as a practical resource. The families that made it through without severe hardship were almost always the ones with the thickest web of community relationships, the most trading partners, the most mutual obligations, the most shared knowledge. Information about where work was available, about which stores would extend credit, about how to access a government relief program. All of this traveled through the same networks. The habit of knowing your neighbors, not just their names, but maintaining real reciprocal relationships with them, was cultivated as a matter of survival. You visited, you helped when help was asked. You maintained the social infrastructure that made practical help possible when it was needed. The 24th habit was skepticism toward institutions. The Depression destroyed trust in several institutions simultaneously. Banks had failed, then taken savings with them. The stock market had been revealed as a vehicle for speculation that destroyed ordinary families. Government had been slow to act for the first 3 years of the crisis. Employers had cut wages and laid off workers with little apparent concern for the consequences. Depression survivors emerged with a more complicated relationship to authority. More commonly than outright radicalism, this meant a low-level, persistent wariness, a tendency to plan for the possibility that the institution you were depending on might not be there when you needed it. This was the psychological foundation of the cash under the mattress, of the full pantry, of the planted garden. It was also, in a more positive register, the foundation of the New Deal coalition, the political alignment of working-class Americans who had experienced what happens when markets are left unregulated and government fails to intervene, and who became reliable supporters of the FDIC, Social Security, the SEC, and the regulatory infrastructure of the post-war American economy. The 25th habit was frugality as identity. This is not the same as any of the previous 24 habits. It's the worldview that made all of them cohere. Before the Depression, frugality was beginning to carry a slightly negative connotation. The person who didn't spend, who didn't participate in the new consumer economy, was beginning to seem old-fashioned in a culture increasingly defining itself through consumption. The Depression reversed this entirely. For a decade, frugality was survival, and after that decade ended, the people who had survived it did not adopt the new consumer culture's values with anything like the enthusiasm of those who hadn't lived through the crisis. They remained people who viewed waste as morally suspect, even during periods of abundance, not because they had thought it through and arrived at a philosophical position, but because their nervous systems had learned, at an age when learning is permanent, that waste was dangerous. that the thing you threw away might be the thing you needed next winter, and that the habit of provision was not a burden, but a form of freedom. This is the habit that made all the others possible. It wasn't about any specific technique or behavior. It was about a fundamental orientation toward material life, one that took seriously the possibility of scarcity, that valued capability over convenience, and that understood the relationship between what you could do for yourself and how much power you had over your own circumstances. What happened to these habits over the course of the 20th century deserves its own documentary. The post-war prosperity, the rise of the supermarket and the fast food chain, the advertising industry's successful reframing of frugality as poverty rather than virtue, the development of cheap disposable goods that made repair seem economically irrational. All of these forces worked against the habits the Depression had built. They worked slowly, and the Depression generation resisted them longer than the generations that followed. None of these habits fully disappeared. Home canning experienced a significant resurgence during the COVID-19 pandemic. The backyard chicken is back in American cities, this time as a choice rather than a given. The FIRE movement, financial independence, retire early, has rebuilt the no-debt, maximum savings philosophy of the Depression generation from scratch, without always knowing where it originally came from. Community seed libraries operate across the country, doing exactly what Depression-era families did with their saved tomato seeds. The habits were built under conditions most Americans living today have never experienced. They were built in kitchens where the math of what went in and what came out was tracked daily because the margin for error was almost nothing. They were built by people who had no reason to believe the hard times would ever end, who built their systems for indefinite endurance rather than temporary inconvenience, and who passed those systems down through the only reliable channel available, the daily life of the household lived in front of the next generation. The woman in Dayton who checked her garden at 5 in the morning did not think of herself as preserving a way of life. She thought of herself as checking the tomatoes. But what she was also doing every morning was teaching her children what it looked like to take the work of provision seriously, to treat the question of how you would feed your family not as something the store would handle, but as something that required your attention, your skill, your labor, and your planning. That lesson didn't require a classroom. It just required proximity to someone who already knew. Most of what that generation knew we have not fully replaced. We have made different arrangements that mostly work, in good times when the institutions hold and the supply chains run and the paycheck arrives on schedule. What the Depression built was something for the other times. Whether those times return at any scale is a question no one can answer, but the people who prepared for them and the habits they passed down deserve to be remembered for what they were. Not poverty, not backwardness, not a failure to modernize, a serious response to a serious world.